Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a massive, highly detailed chronological narrative that spans literally from the historical birth of Jesus all the way to futuristic prophecies of the apocalypse. We're going to unpack the fascinating and honestly sometimes shocking claims presented across our deep dive sources. So whether you're a theology buff or just kind of curious about how ancient texts are being reinterpreted in our modern age, stick around, because this timeline is incredibly revealing.
Since this timeline is immense, covering roughly 5 BC to the prophesied end of the world, we're going to follow a 6-part roadmap. We'll start with the true Christmas story, move to miracles on the map, then death and resurrection, signs before the return, the 7-year tribulation, and finally, wrap it up with the final battle.
All right, part 1, the true Christmas story, uncovering Bethlehem. Our first source completely dismantles the popular modern misconceptions about the birth of Jesus. It strips away the cozy holiday traditions to reveal a much grittier historical reality. Forget the pristine wooden stable you see in standard nativity scenes. The source points out that Jesus was actually born in a dark, smelly cave where animals were kept. And those famous wise men, the Magi? Well, they weren't at the birth at all. According to the timeline, they didn't arrive until after Mary and Joseph visited the temple in Jerusalem, which was over 40 days later.
And it turns out, when those wealthy magi finally did show up, they unknowingly triggered a massive geopolitical crisis. You see, they went straight to the wildly paranoid ruler King Herod and asked for the new king of the Jews. Now, the source notes that Herod was so notoriously brutal that Augustus Caesar once joked it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. So feeling his throne threatened, Herod issued a horrific decree to execute infants in Bethlehem. This violently forced Jesus' family to flee to Egypt as refugees.
Moving right along to part 2, Miracles on the Map, the Galilean Ministry.
After surviving that brutal early chapter, the family quietly settled in Nazareth. But this set the stage for an explosive, highly localized ministry that shocked his neighbors and the Roman authorities alike. Let's trace his journey across ancient Israel. He kicks things off in Cana with his first recorded miracle, turning water into wine at a wedding. Next up is Capernaum, where the source highlights something really significant: healing leprosy. Back then, this was a disease Jewish people believed only their prophesied savior could cure. Finally, he heads to a pretty shocking location, Caesarea Philippi. The source describes this as a pagan underworld shrine, literally known to locals as the gates of hell. And right there, at the gates of hell, Jesus claims his spiritual authority would ultimately conquer it.
This brings us to part 3, death and resurrection, the ultimate confrontation.
Claiming divine authority in the countryside is one thing. Doing it in the political and religious epicenter is a whole different ballgame. Jesus basically became a massive political liability. According to the source, performing incredibly public miracles, like literally raising his friend Lazarus from the dead, was a big deal. But his words? His words are what truly sparked the outrage. When challenged, he applied God's ancient title to himself, declaring, "Before Abraham was, I am." The source explains that the religious leaders were terrified. They furiously voted to execute him right then and there, convinced the Roman Empire would see this as treason and destroy their entire nation in retaliation.
This tension set off a rapid, incredibly climactic chain of events over just one single week. It kicks off with a royal welcome on a donkey, which quickly spirals into his arrest, and then a brutal Roman crucifixion under the mock title King of the Jews. But the source narrative doesn't end in defeat. It culminates in a reported resurrection 3 days later, an event that completely shifted his followers' mission from a small, local Galilean movement into a global phenomenon.
Following his ascension, our second source completely shifts gears. Welcome to part 4, Signs Before the Return, the Prophetic Shift.
We are moving from ancient history straight into the present day. The creator of this second source claims there are exactly 17 biblical signs leading up to the end times. The very first of these signs is what ancient texts call the beginning of sorrows. The source intriguingly interprets this as an unprecedented global conflict. In fact, they point specifically to World War I as the exact moment this prophetic countdown began.
This is a brilliant illustration of how ancient texts are being mapped directly onto modern events. The source argues we are currently seeing these early signs play out in real time. They point to ongoing global wars, historic levels of religious persecution, noting that roughly 1 in 7 Christians globally face high levels of discrimination today, and, fascinatingly, the rise of false prophets using modern social media to amass huge, deceptive followings.
Now, before diving into the darker prophecies, the source organizes theological interpretations of a promised 1,000-year era of peace known as the millennium into 3 distinct camps. You have amillennialism, which views it as a spiritual allegory happening right now. Postmillennialism, which believes humanity will actually create an era of peace before the return. And finally, premillennialism. The source explicitly states that this explainer follows the premillennial view, which basically means the world is going to get a lot worse before it gets better, leading to a literal 1,000-year reign only after the return.
This literal, premillennial timeline perfectly sets the stage for Part 5, the 7-year tribulation, the Antichrist, and the mark.
This is a highly structured, truly horrific period where a terrifying global dictator is prophesied to emerge. But right before this 7-year tribulation kicks off, the source introduces the rapture, the sudden removal of believers from the earth. Again, they break down 3 main perspectives. Our source heavily favors the pre-tribulation view. They argue that early Christians, like the Apostle Paul, used imminent language, fully expecting to be spared from the prophesied wrath that defines those 7 years.
Following this mass disappearance, the timeline details the rapid rise of the Antichrist. The source claims he's going to exploit modern globalism to broker a massive Middle East peace treaty spanning exactly 7 years. He will allegedly survive a deadly wound, winning global awe. But exactly halfway through, at the 3.5-year mark, he completely breaks the treaty and commits the abomination of desolation, literally declaring himself God in a rebuilt Jerusalem temple.
Now, let's look at how this builds into a scenario straight out of a sci-fi thriller. The ancient texts say this dictator will create an image or a statue that can actually speak and kill dissenters. How is that even possible? Well, the source chillingly points to modern technology. They suggest that a swarm of autonomous AI assassin drones using everyday tech like the Face ID chips in our cell phones perfectly fits this 2,000-year-old description of a talking, killing statue. It's wild to think about.
And this technological interpretation extends directly to the infamous mark of the beast. To participate in what the source says will become a completely cashless global economy, citizens will be forced to take this mark on their right hand or forehead. What's really interesting here is the source points out that these specific body parts mimic an ancient Jewish command to bind God's laws to their hands and heads. So it suggests the dictator is actively mocking ancient devotions.
But what about that famous number, 666? The source explains this number will be calculated from the Antichrist's name using an ancient practice called gematria, where letters are assigned numerical values. Blending the ancient with the ultra-modern, the creator theorizes that this could very easily be tied to a required microchip serial number embedded within a global, cashless AI system.
All of this terrifying buildup culminates at the end of those 7 years, which brings us to our final section, the final battle, Armageddon.
Before that final, massive clash, the source points to a very specific, unfulfilled prophecy tucked away in the book of Isaiah. The ancient text claims the Assyrian city of Damascus, which happens to be one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, will suddenly become a ruinous heap. The creator argues that, given current geopolitics, this specific event could happen at literally any moment today.
Ultimately, the prophetic timeline dictates that the Antichrist will gather the armies of the world at a specific location in Israel called Megiddo. We more commonly know this place as Armageddon. It is here, the source claims, that Christ will literally return from heaven with an army, cast the Antichrist into a lake of fire, and finally establish that literal 1,000-year era of peace on earth.
These sources brilliantly demonstrate just how deeply ancient biblical texts are being reinterpreted today, filtering 2,000-year-old words through the lens of modern geopolitics, cashless societies, and autonomous AI presents an incredibly captivating narrative. But it leaves us with a profound question to chew on. Are we looking at a literal map of our inevitable future, or are we simply looking in a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest modern anxieties? It's a fascinating thought to leave you with. Thanks for exploring this timeline with me today.